The shelves are full of goods touting eco-friendly alternatives as companies adopt green practices. But where did it all start, and what does the future hold? Well, my guest today is Willem van Rijn. He's the Chief Operations Officer for Greenpeace International. We recently sat down at his home in Wickford to explore the role Greenpeace has played and continues to play in preserving the planet. I'm Ann Marie Spatharakis. Thank you for joining us today in the studio. Greenpeace is known for its direct action. How have those direct action campaigns helped, or maybe even at times hurt, the image of Greenpeace?
That's a good question. If you think about direct action, that of course is what we are known for. It happens in far more of a system, than people realize when they see it, because it looks like kind of cool to climb the smokestack or be up there in the Arctic or the Antarctic with our major ships or sailor ships around the world to expose all sorts of harm. But we have a couple of principles that we work with, which is probably good to talk about briefly. And the first one of that is bearing witness. The actions are all about bearing witness. So in the old Quaker tradition, which is an American tradition, after all, Greenpeace did come out of an American or Canadian, North American culture, a Canadian organization, group of people that did this 40 years ago now, 41 years ago almost. Bearing witness, some of them were Quakers. Bearing witness has always been big in the Quaker belief, and exposing what's wrong, confronting it openly, is part of bearing witness. So that's when the founders of this organization sailed out to the island of Kamchatka to protest against nuclear development, or against not energy at the time, but nuclear weapons, which is really where the peace in Greenpeace came from first. Now the green, it's obvious, the green is a bigger part of us than the peace, but we still believe those are connected. So that was done for a reason, of course. It wasn't just the action, it was bearing witness. And it was also a form of what we call nonviolent direct action, which is in the tradition of, say, Martin Luther King, which essentially recognizes that certain laws can be broken when they are wrong, which is essentially nonviolent direct action, which is what we did even 40 years ago in the very first action when we sailed into territory where we were accosted, of course, and arrested by the U.S. Navy because we were somewhere where we weren't supposed to be. And we were there at significant risk, because if they had blown it, they could have blown us up at the time. And a lot of our people take that risk. The third principle is that of independence. So in order to do what we do, in order to confront businesses and governments, because that's in the end our goal, it's not to just get popular support. What we do with that popular support is to push businesses and government into changing behavior and changing laws. Right? That's what it's all about. That's the only way in which we get success. So the actions are merely a tool, an important one, to bring pressure onto governments and onto businesses. And for that, our third principle is independence. So we don't take a penny of donations from companies, although quite a few companies would love to give us some money because it would impact our independence. And we also don't take a penny from governments, unlike many other conservation organizations. Many people are sometimes surprised that our average donation for this global organization that operates in 40 countries in the world is $8 a month in recurrent giving. So we have millions of supporters around the world, not just supporters for money. Of course, we have many more that support the cause, but millions of small donors that make up this movement, I think. And it's interesting that after 40 years, you can still call it a movement, not just an organization, because it is.
Before we go into more detail about how your organization has changed the behavior of companies and governments, you mentioned the first nonviolent direct action campaign in Kamchatka, and I want to talk about how that actually is connected to Rhode Island and also to Quakers. I was amazed to learn that Irving Stowe, who was one of the founders of Greenpeace, was born in Providence, Rhode Island. He received a degree in economics from Brown University, went on to study law at Yale, moved to New Zealand, where he and his wife both became Quakers before moving to Canada and becoming full-time activists.
Right.
He also received the distinction from Brown University as one of the top 100 most influential Brown graduates of the 20th century. As I understand it, the U.S. government in the 1960s had been conducting underwater nuclear testing off the coast of Alaska. And in 1970, when Irving Stowe was living in Canada, the U.S. government was planning another of these tests
Right.
near Amchitka for the following year, which is when he and others decided to hold a benefit concert to fund a trip, as you said, to bear witness, a fundamental Quaker principle. And it was from that series of events that the Greenpeace movement actually began. Can you talk a little more about that concert?
Right. This was in the 70s. It was on the West Coast, of course. And these people were highly, like Irving Stowe, highly educated, committed people. They clearly were liberals, of course, at the time. And this was the day in which Joni Mitchell was great and James Taylor was coming up and great. And they were able from the beginning to get these celebrities, onto our cause.
Yesterday a child came out to wonder.
And it was half Canadians, half Americans, and they did a concert to celebrate their departure for Amchitka, in which Joni Mitchell and James Taylor were the main feature. And in fact, for our anniversary last year, we were 40 years old last year. We reissued from our Canadian office. We reissued that CD. So you can buy that anywhere. It's called the Amchitka Concert, and it is vintage. Joni Mitchell. It's live. Joni Mitchell, James Taylor, and it's a double CD.
And the seasons, they go round and round, and the
And that was a major part of our initial support. That trip that we made was made with a rented boat, with people that didn't really know what they were doing. They knew where they were going, but it was a real, a risky effort of taking out to sea that far with an inexperienced crew, and they caught the imagination of the world, and all over the world. Now that was the basis of action, basically the beginning of which they were able to capture the imagination of the world and grow from there. Now today, of course, it's much more difficult to capture the imagination of the world. What has happened with the disbursement of media and the internet, and all the people out there who are doing their own forms of direct action, it is much harder to get the attention of the world with something spectacular. But so far, we're still going strong and able to do it.
An astounding 10,000 people showed up for that Amchitka concert to hear James Taylor and Joni Mitchell and to put this Quaker principle of bearing witness into action. After raising this money and renting the boat, what did they do and what was their goal?
It was true bearing witness, right? It wasn't a day that you didn't have satellite cameras and so on board, so they knew they would have to tell the story later, but they went over there. They had a communications expert, because one of them was a communications expert, a political expert like Irving Stowe, and they rented this boat from this fishing captain and went out, and their purpose was to bear witness, come back and tell the world about it, expecting fully that it would be spectacular, of course, because they fully expected to get arrested. As they did, they fully expected not to be able to really enter the zone because the whole Navy was there, waiting for them. But it was to get the world's attention to that particular action as a way to use it as a platform to now make that a debate in society about nuclear power. And that in that sense that succeeded significantly. Because, of course, over time, that stopped.
There's something in the way she moves, or looks my way or calls my name, that seems to leave.
We had a more tragic situation years later when we did the same thing against the French government from New Zealand, which was testing nuclear devices in the atolls in the South Pacific, where we were mounting a campaign, and we had been there a number of times. We were a real thorn in the sides of the French Navy at the time and the French nuclear powers. And they decided, they made a huge mistake that time, but they went into the Auckland Harbour in New Zealand, this is now 26 years ago, and decided to destroy one of our ships. So the Navy SEALs, the government of France, blew up our Rainbow Warrior in the harbour of Auckland, New Zealand, which at the time, 26 years ago, if you were to go back to the newsreels, you'd see it was a massive international incident, killed one of our people. It's the only time one of our people was killed. There was a Portuguese photographer who worked for our organization in Amsterdam, where I also work, which is where our headquarters is. And that was a major scandal. It was stupidly done in that they were caught within 24 hours. They had to admit it. Major reparations were paid to family, major reparations were paid to Greenpeace, and in a very paradoxical way, it put us really on the map at that point, because those people, if anybody hadn't heard of Greenpeace by that time, after we were there for 15 years, they heard of us then, because it became a major incident and actually financially allowed us to expand much faster than we otherwise could have because of the reparation payments that we got. So in that sense, it had the right impact. It shows you we are working against serious enemies. At this time, that was a exceedingly tragic one, but don't underestimate still what's happening today. I mean, we have instances in the Amazon, we have installations in the Paradise Forest in Indonesia, we have an installation in the Congo. These are the main rainforest areas. We have a big rainforest anti-deforestation campaign, and in that campaign, our people are running daily risks. I mean, there are regular death threats, they're regular chased away, they're regular on gunpoint, told to get off somebody's land, and that kind of thing. And the people that are doing this for us, they are volunteers, and there are our own people in these countries, are the unsung heroes of Greenpeace, because they are on the front lines, seeing what happens, feeding us the information, working with local communities, which we then, of course, can use for our global campaigns. So the risk is not entirely gone. It's just not at the high seas anymore as much.
As you just mentioned, some of your biggest detractors are very wealthy, very powerful corporate interests, or in some cases, even governments.
Oh, yes.
Does it ever feel like a David and Goliath situation?
Of course it is. I mean, we are the largest environmental activist organization in the world by far, but we are tiny. I mean, we have a budget. We're actually big, but to give you a comparison, we are raising about $300 million a year, or in the 40 countries where we work. That is smaller than, I'm sure, the marketing budget just for so-called greenwash, we call it greenwash, green energy of the major oil companies. So we are dwarfed in terms of expenditures, ability to reach the public, and certainly in terms of political power. We feel like David and Goliath, but David won in the end. Don't forget that. But also, we feel like we are winning many things. And I can give you an example how we do that. You might find it interesting. But the tragic part of it nowadays is when you talk about the larger picture of climate change, we are winning many battles, but we are losing the planet. That's the way we think about it now, because we are truly not achieving what we'd like to achieve. The world, as a species, we're not achieving what we should achieve. But to give you some example of what we do, in our corporate campaigning, with our millions of supporters, and with the tools nowadays with the web, we are by far the most active and sophisticated NGO on the web out there. We're able to marshal lots of people to further our causes. Give you something close to home here. We had a very interesting Barbie campaign. Now, what the public sees, to go from what the public sees, they suddenly see on their Facebook, millions of people on the Facebook, they see a silly campaign where Ken is coming out with a funny video that says, Ken is divorcing, or I Ken am divorcing Barbie because she has a bad deforestation habit. That was the cute visuals and everything with it. So what we did, we went after Mattel. Why? Mattel is using all its packaging that it uses for all its dolls, Barbie and others, for their toys, is bought from a company called, who is our real enemy, a company called Asian Pulp and Paper, which is a closely held major polluter in Asia, which is cutting down rainforests, has major paper and pulp factories, which is in the end the paper that Mattel uses. It's the paper that Lego uses, the paper that the whole toy industry tends to use because it's relatively cheap, but it comes out of the rainforest. So think of it, that's what the public sees. So we are trying to get millions of emails, which happened to Mattel, so we actually clogged their entire website. And people are saying, we're not going to buy these dolls anymore, if you don't change your behavior, because this campaign went viral in many countries. So Mattel turned around, and it was not a big deal for them. They knew it. They didn't want to talk to us before. Otherwise, we would never have run the campaign. We don't do this without announcing it. They didn't want to talk to us before. Well, we had them. We were in their offices within 48 hours after this campaign launched, and they changed their supply chain practices. And with it, interestingly, the entire toy industry, Lego came on board a week later, and so on, because they saw what is happening. So we're using kind of a threat, call it a brand attack, right, on Mattel, in order to deal with a company down the supply chain in Asia called Asia Pulp and Paper, because the only way we could hurt that company is if they start losing customers, right? That was our only lever, if you will, that we have of power over that company. In addition, of course, we are negotiating with the Indonesian government. They see this increases the unpopularity of it. And of course, what the science shows us, why is it deforestation? Well, deforestation is about 20% of the climate change, global warming problem that we have in the world. I mean, the rainforest acts as the lungs of the world, if you will. They purify, they clean the air. And 25% of the problem today is the current rate reduction and the burning of the rainforests as we see it. So it's crucial, we believe, to the existence of our species, of our lifestyle. So that's the larger purpose. The science tells us it's that way, which is our scientific background, of course. That's undisputed. And then we use people power on brands, in this case, to change governments or change businesses. Similar case, interesting, we're very proud of this one. In China, we've run a toxics. This is not about global warming, this is about toxics, one of our major campaigns, general pollution. The sweatshops in China are exceedingly unhealthy. Now, if you look at the rates of children dying, cancer rates, and every health measure you look at in those big sweatshop areas where all the textile of the world almost is produced nowadays, in these massive factories in China, it has huge chemical problems, which are water problems. It ends up in the water. Everybody drinks it and everybody uses it, and the conditions are quite horrific. So what do we do? And this one, which is interesting in a country like China, where we are not dealing with a regime that is necessarily open to pressure. But this is an issue that they themselves are looking at, that they themselves would like to change. This is a big country, so their local government has lots of powers. It's not that easy for the Chinese central government to change things all the time. So we mounted a major campaign against Nike, against Adidas, against H&M for we called it the Detox Campaign. And just like the same example I had before, this was all last year, by the way. These were successful campaigns, much of it on the web, but not all of it. We were in front in all these countries. We were in front of the factories. We were in front of retail shops. With placards. We can mount campaigns the same day, the same week in tens of countries. So the brand pays attention, and right up to the very top, they pay attention. And interestingly, in Nike, it really worked well because Nike, Adidas, Puma, they're like the three big competitors of sports clothing. Actually, after they figured this out, they changed their supply chain, or they promised to change their supply chain, which is a huge deal because it's very hard to do. It takes years to really change it altogether. But now Nike, if you go to their websites, Nike, Adidas, Puma, they are all competing to be the greenest. So the victory is that we actually change the behavior. And in this case, and this shows you how we work and why it's so important that we work globally, we were able to have an agreement with the Chinese government, always in the background, of course, but the Chinese government has issued rules for banning certain toxics. They used our list that we provided through our scientists and our connections with science through the government. And so it is now a rule of law in China for these factories not to use these chemicals anymore, which is really our first main victory in a country as difficult as China. So we're really focusing on those countries, of course, China, the US, Brazil, India, as that's where the main solutions lie to the longer term pollution and climate problems that we have.
Do you find that people in general are unaware of the role that Greenpeace is playing in these types of changes in the way companies do business? I'm sure
people have often no idea. Sometimes there are even campaigns that they have no idea that we're behind them. Sometimes it's very, very visible. We had a campaign, by the way, it's a funny one, this last year. We ran a anti-Facebook campaign on Facebook. If you were to go to the Facebook pages, it was Unfriend Facebook campaign run on Facebook, which was because Facebook, as you know, the companies like Facebook, the social network, Google, are using huge amounts of electricity nowadays, right? If you take the cloud, if you will, types of services out there, they are the fifth largest. They were like the fifth largest country in the world in terms of electricity usage. So how they procure electricity is a big deal. So that's always the science in back of what we do. So they just built a huge new data center, almost completely fueled by an old coal-fired power plant. And we just railed against that. And companies like Facebook that are supposed to be modern, supposed to be the future, supposed to be young, many of their members young people who have to live in the dirty environment that we're building for them today in our generation, my generation, should not do it. And they came around very quickly. It was actually very nice that it was a funny campaign. We ridiculed Mark Zuckerberg and have told everybody on Facebook to unfriend Mark Zuckerberg. And it worked. It worked well. They took it seriously because many companies. This is not that companies are bad. Sometimes companies are behaving badly, but the people are good. People are doing things. People are having children. They have families. They want the best thing for the world, and they don't often themselves realize what it is they're doing. And sometimes it takes us or people like us to shake them up a bit. And we find in many companies, privately, people will agree with us with what we're doing, even though not always the company supports it. In this case, Mark Zuckerberg, and who runs it, is able to make a decision relatively quickly and made a promise that all of their energy will be based on renewable energy in X years. So that was another one of those victories. So yes, we can do those kinds of things, but people can do something too. If you take the success of all these campaigns, millions of people had to write emails to the Mattels of this world, to the Nikes, to the Facebook. They have to, even though it's something as simple as what we call clicktivism instead of activism, that all this is click, I like it, or I share it, but still, it helps because people are concerned about what people think, and we can marshal millions. So people can do that kind of little stuff. People can work in demonstrations with us because we have in this country, for example, in the U.S., now we have grassroots organizations that, whenever necessary, will mobilize people. You can become an actual volunteer, and there still is space in this society for physical presence. There is space for people who are out there confronting politicians right away. Everybody has a role to play. There are also many people that do what we do, right? There are so many organizations involved in environmental activism, environmental activities. There's so many people that care, and we all can do our own thing on a global basis, like what we're trying to do with Greenpeace, and what I had the privilege of doing now, working for Greenpeace. The link to Rhode Island actually is a nice one, even though, and especially for me as an immigrant, I've been here 30 years now in this country, and I came from the Netherlands, so the headquarters of Greenpeace is in the Netherlands. In Europe, we are far bigger relative to the population than in the United States. That's how the headquarters, in the end, was moved over there. But we all can play a role. I'm fortunate that I can play this role that I'm now playing. But on a little scale or a medium scale or on a local scale, the problems are all here, and we can all do something.
Willem van Rijn is the Chief Operations Officer for Greenpeace International. We'll continue our conversation after this short break. Thanks so much for joining us today in the studio. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, my guest is Willem van Rijn. He's the Chief Operations Officer of Greenpeace International. I recently sat down with Mr. van Rijn to discuss the role Greenpeace International is playing on a global scale and how that work also affects us right here in Rhode Island. Here's more of that conversation. You mentioned your international headquarters are in the Netherlands, so I imagine you travel back and forth quite a bit. Do you find Europeans and people in other parts of the world are more conscious of and vocal about environmental issues? And if so, why?
It's interesting to distinguish between, as I ponder that question, it's interesting to distinguish between the people and the country as a whole. I think it is still true that compared to Europe, Western Europe for sure, being green is far, far further along than here. I mean, in the U.S., if you look at us as a country, we per capita consume 2.5 times the energy of the average European, while our lifestyle is now certainly no better. So the lifestyle, the standard of living is the same, and is 2.5 times more energy consumed per capita here. And that should be easy to change through measures of conservation, a big part, but also through insulation, electric cars, and what have you, right? And on that score, the Europeans are simply much farther along. I mean, we still have a group of politicians here in this country where 80% of the Republican politicians in this country state publicly that they do not believe, or they do not believe that it is proven that climate change actually exists, or that it is caused by us humans. Well, that is anywhere else in the developed world, that is such a ridiculous notion. There isn't a single politician in Western Europe who would dare to make that kind of argument, because it's plainly wrong. It's not a matter anymore of believing, it is a matter of fact. And still the politics in this country are talking about whether we should believe that climate change is happening or not. As long as our leaders are behaving that way, of course, we are being led, our people behave less in that way also. At the same time, I think, to answer the people part, so the government part is clear. We're not just behind, we're way behind. And by the way, we're not just behind in our ability to clean up our environment, we're also way behind in grasping the economic opportunity that comes from retooling our entire economy towards a lower energy environment. Now, the Chinese are way ahead, the Germans are way ahead. Investments in infrastructure, in technology, in innovation are made everywhere, except in this country, nearly at that pace, because we do not have the regulatory government infrastructure that allows it. Gasoline here is still less than half, it's about a third of the price in Europe. But why do you think some of those taxes go in Europe that are for the higher gas prices? They go to innovation, they go for financing of infrastructure, they go to subsidies for electric cars. All that kind of thing, which we hardly are able to do there. So innovation is allowed to prosper there through government regulation. In China, we're way ahead. They're way ahead of us in their infrastructure. They're driven by sheer necessity. It is not that the Chinese are care so much more about the environment, but they're living with 1 billion people all on top of each other in these massive cities on the East Coast that are becoming rapidly unlivable. So the Chinese policy is to become far more energy independent. They have to import all their energy, and it has to be clean because they can't breathe their own air anymore. So they are moving way ahead. And when China moves, it moves, right? And we all see this in every part of industry. I'm a businessman. I did come out of business most of my career. When it moves, and it moves big. So renewable energy production in terms of solar panels, innovation in solar, in terms of wind power, is moving faster in China than anywhere else, and it's also moving faster in Germany than anywhere else. Take a company like Siemens. Siemens is a German engineering company, one of the biggest companies in the world, was the largest nuclear engineering and turbine provider, if you will, in the world. Now that the German government has decided it steps out of nuclear altogether, they see where the wind is blowing in the rest of the world, and on the long term, they have decided to get out of the nuclear business altogether, which is huge for Siemens, and moving all that massive resource that they have towards improvement of technologies for solar and for renewable energies. You drive anywhere through Europe, or in Germany, particularly in the Netherlands as well, but especially in Germany. There's not a place in Germany when you drive through it where you don't somewhere see on the horizons bunch of wind farms, and windmills, and it's become a normal part of the landscape. So yes, the answer is they are further along, but in this country, I think, like in everything right now, this is a political opinion, I think the people and the local levels and the state levels and many institutions are way further along than our politicians. Our politicians in this country aren't leading, they are following. So while the states are taking more actions, here in Rhode Island, right, there was in the local press not too long ago, I think it was the last couple of weeks, that the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is led by a man who I had a long meeting with just a few months ago, Dr. Pachauri in India, issues all these statistics. And the water levels here in Rhode Island are projected at the current rate of global warming to rise by 5 to 7 feet in 100 years. The town of Wickford, where we're sitting here in a house that is 275 years old, will be underwater. This house, at the rate we're going now, is simply not going to. This whole historical section of Wickford in 100 years will not be here anymore. And this is not being radical, or is not being overly exaggerating. This is virtual fact. The trend we're on in global warming, which was 3 degrees Celsius to 4 degrees Celsius, is where we're now heading, will result in sea levels in the world rising by about 2 feet, between 1.5 and 2 feet. But it's not the same in every area. In our area, it's 5 to 7 feet. There's no way we can protect this whole coastal state, the ocean state, with massive dams everywhere. There's no will to do it, for that matter, as well. So we are talking about things that are happening here, and we see that local institutions are actually doing something about it. This is a Navy state, right? I know from friends of mine, friends of my son, who are in the Navy here, who are dealing with these issues. The Navy has objectives that are far more insightful than their bosses in Washington. I mean, the Navy has objectives for energy independence. The Navy has objectives for reduction of fossil fuel consumption. Massive, very ambitious ones. So they see it coming. They're not doubting it. But their leaders, the politicians, are still saying that it's not happening. And the CIA in this country has, a long time ago already, defined that the biggest security threat to this country is its energy dependence. Right, so even from that point of view, renewable energy is the way to go. The environmental movement is not a radical group of activists or hippies anymore. Surely they may be a bit more willing to break the rules than many other people in society, but the sheer fact that it's able to attract people like me, right, who have had a whole career on Wall Street, where I was reasonably successful, and who have not spent their life worrying about these issues. Any sane person, in my mind, who is at this point, especially people in my state of life, I just turned 62, has to put the facts together. If you're halfway reasonably smart, you look at the facts, you look at what's happening, you look at the environment, you look at your children, you look at your grandchildren, and you have to come to the conclusion that something has to be done. And it's not radical anymore. It's about keeping the world in the way it ought to be. And it's also about a generation, in my view, this is a personal statement, it's about a generational duty almost, because it's my generation, the baby boomers, in the last 40, 50 years since I grew up, that have made the world what it is today. And the way the world it is today is absolutely not sustainable. It is not sustainable for our children, not for our grandchildren. And I think we have an obligation to do something about it, whether it is something small or whether it's something just financial, or whether you go to an extreme like me in working for a place like Greenpeace for a number of years to try to make a difference.
You mentioned coming from a corporate background. You were one time the president of GTEC and have had a long, distinguished career in the corporate world. I'm wondering, what kind of transition is that, going from a corporate culture to one of the world's largest activist organizations? What skills sort of transfer, and what is really different?
There are far more similarities than one would think between the corporate world and these big global NGO organizations. I mean, we have cultural issues amongst our different countries. We have power issues amongst our different people. We have many different opinions. That happens in the corporate world just the same. I find that having worked always in finance and for a short while as the international part of GTEC, that the corporate world, of course, is able to take decisions more quickly. They are hierarchically organized. At the end of the day, if the boss wants to do something, then it happens. It may take a while. Not everybody may agree. Some people get fired, have to get out of the way, but it will happen. Running a movement, if you will, which is a federated organization, all of our offices are operating under license agreements with our head office, if you will, but they have a large degree of self-determination. So our job in the head office is to coordinate all these countries and to deliver the central resources like our ocean-going ships and the large global campaigns and the technology infrastructure and the like. And when it comes to all kinds of things, which is my responsibility, I'm the chief operating officer of Greenpeace, so I'm the number two, and I'm the guy behind the scenes. So I'm not the one who you will see on TV as the spokesperson anywhere, even though we've obviously spoken here mostly about what we do on the outside world. I'm responsible for the inner workings of this place globally to actually occur. And in that sense, it's like a corporate environment. It has an IT department, there's a finance department, an HR department, it has policies, it has rules. But it is much more difficult in an NGO to get everybody in line because they have a higher level of independence. And it's an activist organization. So you get activism internally as well. Many people who work for us are born activists. I remember I had just come and just joined Greenpeace, and I was there for 3 or 4 weeks. And suddenly all the lights were out in our cafeteria in the office. And I said, what's happening here? Well, the cafeteria, we have about 200 people in this office. And in the cafeteria, a group of activists, they had been complaining that not all our lights were fully LED, not fully energy efficient, because they'd just been in this building a short while. And the lights were gone. And they were in a bag somewhere with a big banner over it that they made, about this issue, and let's get clean Greenpeace. For example, in corporate behavior, it's impossible that people would risk their careers. But in an environment like this, it was, yay, these were cool guys, they did this, and actually it was kind of cool. 3 weeks later, I was approached by the head of our toxics campaign, who was a fiery Lebanese woman who runs our global toxics campaign, and we were all using BlackBerries at the time. And BlackBerry was the lowest on the list. We do so many things. But one of the things we do, we produce a consumer list of bad electronics from a green environmental perspective. And RIM, the maker of BlackBerry, was at the very bottom of the list. So I suddenly had a whole campaign, and she came to me, and I got emails. And she was campaigning. I got probably 200 emails from people all over the system that she told to send me emails to change to the Apple iPhone. Which we all wanted anyway, because it's much nicer to have an iPhone, we thought, than a BlackBerry. But that's the kind of campaign. But for sure, we now all have an iPhone. But I'm sure that if Apple ever, by the way, Apple changed its behavior completely. They were at the target of one of our biggest technology campaigns years ago. Major shouting matches at the time between Steve Jobs and my then boss and friend Gert Leipold, who about them not being environmentally clean enough, and they ended up changing their behavior, and they are at the top of the list now of the good guys, if you will. But so you get those kinds of campaigns internally. That's a big difference. In terms of working with people who are so committed to a cause, creates a different working environment, right? Because people are very committed to what they do. You're not working for people who are in it for the money on the whole, and not just the campaigners, but also the people in HR departments and finance and ITs. We don't pay as well as what most of these people could make elsewhere. So there's a different level of motivation, which means you also need a different level of encouragement and a different level of interaction. And the way to do that is through transparency, much more collaboration. You have to explain far more to people in these environments why you're doing something, what you're doing, because they all feel that they have to, even if you make an IT change, they have to believe in it, and that's a big change. But at the end of the day, I find, especially for somebody in my job, that many of these issues are not that different. In terms of success measures, one of the biggest difference, and it is kind of funny, is that I never thought I would be working for an activity where, in part, our success of my boss is measured by how many times he gets arrested. Working in financial services, in New York, this is not what you want to hear, because you lose your job when that happens. But in our case, he was arrested 3 times last year.
Or you don't lose your job when that happens.
Right. But in our case, Kumi, my friend and boss, who's a wonderful South African activist, born activist out of the anti-apartheid struggle. Was arrested 3 times this year. Once climbing in the Arctic, the poor guy, coming all the way from South Africa, not being used to the cold. Now climbed as part of our campaigns, climbed a big drilling rig in the Arctic, and was arrested and thrown into jail. And the whole organization, when that happened, goes yes, and that's of course very different from anywhere else, because it attracts publicity, and we need that publicity to get the public support we need. So
I'd like to talk about Rhode Island and the fishing industry. It's one thing to hear about overfishing, but to actually see the videos on your website of these just massive dragnets. And I can only imagine tons of wildlife, that from fish to birds and sea turtles,
right,
that are just killed and discarded back into the ocean, is just shocking.
It is shocking.
How does that kind of non-sustainable or unsustainable fishing practice affect the fishing industry, even here in Rhode Island?
Well, these kind of fishing practices, of course, have affected the fishing community, the small fisherman community along the whole eastern seaboard here for a long time. The fish are already, of course, disappearing. In fact, I was talking to a friend of ours here in Wickford, who is a fisherman, who said that right off the coast here of Point Judith, about, say, 20 years ago, when they went out on the fishing contests, they would catch 1,000, or the winner would usually catch a 1,000, 11, or 1,200 pound tuna within 3 miles offshore. Well, first of all, now you don't ever catch tuna they don't exist anymore. And if you catch any tuna of 300-400 pounds, which is about as big as they get nowadays, you have to be 150 miles offshore. So there's already a major impact in the levels of fish on these waters here. We believe that it is the large industrial fishing capacity that is ruining the industry. We are very much promoting the well-being of the small fishing fleets here, the lobster fishing, the small fishing, coastal fishing, because that's not what's bringing the problem. The problem is the fact that 2% of the world's fishing fleet is emptying this 98% of the fish, around the world. And this is, of course, especially true in Asia, but also in the end here. So it is the large industrialized fishing, which is happening by American companies, European companies, Asian companies, that is the real problem, and that we are fighting. We have our own little navy. We're known for our maritime tradition, so we have these 3 boats. They're all ocean-going boats, and 2 of them are now engaged in a big tuna campaign in Asia, actually, not here, against these big overfishing companies. But nobody can be optimistic about the future of the fishing industry here, and we believe that we ought to protect the small. There's no problem with the small fishermen, with the small fishing boats or the kind of size that we have here of coastal fishing. The problem is in the large practices of the big drag nets or the floating nets that are set out, in the ocean where there are the 11-mile long nets where everything is caught, the bycatch included. But it's not. It is. Look at the science. I mean, people basically understand that our children or our children's children, the way it now goes, will only know tuna from people like us, who will one day say to them, one day we had this wonderful thing called tuna, because it's unlikely that tuna will survive.
Would you like to talk a little bit about genetically engineered, genetically modified plants and foods?
Yep. This is one of the big differences between Europe and the United States. The Europeans have been concerned about genetic engineered foods for a long time, and we have been far more successful in helping that along, if you will, in Europe than in the U.S. One of the explanations that one could have is in the U.S. It is the voices of industry, the power of industry, the industrial lobbies on our political system, the farm lobbies especially, have been far, far stronger. It's one of the most strongest lobbying forces in this country, and in Europe that's much less so. Agriculture is a much smaller part of the European economy than it is of the American one, and it has an industrial lobby here that is very, very strong and rooted in small politics, right? It goes down to every small little town, and as a result it's a very hard lobby to fight against. Also, fighting against large corporate interests is something that is less popular in the United States than in Europe. And companies like Monsanto that actually dominate the genetic engineered seed business are far more easy to argue against in Europe than it is here. Europeans have all along bought the argument from the very early start that genetically engineered crops reduce biodiversity in the world and in the entire agricultural system. They concentrate power in the hands of very few seed companies, by the way. The economical argument in terms of yields and production that is always pushed by these companies and by the farmers isn't really true, and the risks of outbreaks of things that these things are not resistant to, if you will, has only increased. So whether you look at the small farmer in Latin America or in Africa that somehow by his government has been talked into engineered seeds, that farmer is now far more dependent on only 1 or 2 suppliers of seeds and is paying far more and is not seeing the yields, or whether you look at the risk of biodiversity. And this is something this country simply hasn't bought it. And I think it's starting now. People are now more worried about monocultures. They're more worried about what's doing to our crops. They're more worried about what it's doing to biodiversity. But it's one of those areas where Europe picked it up earlier.
What is the best advice you've ever received?
I think it's hard to choose because I've been lucky that I've had a lot of good advice. But I think late in life it was advice from Kathleen. She said at one point, the most important things in life are not things. And this is something I think about every day. It makes me emotional thinking about that. It's interesting. But it's very important advice because I'm dealing in concepts. And I think that and this is probably for attribution, that we can talk about all these problems, right? We've talked today about oceans, about fish, about pollution, about energy, about agriculture. What we haven't talked about is, at the end of the day, the root cause of all of this is our consumption society. It's a society based on needing to consume, needing to grow. And we now have 1.5 billion people in China and 1 billion people in India who are aspiring to be as well off as we are, and increasingly they are slowly, but certainly they are succeeding at it. In China's case, not so slowly. They're aspiring to the same kind of consumption. We are not willing to change and able to change the consumption patterns in our society. And consumption is all about things, which is why Kathleen's advice is so important to us, because unless we change our consumption habits down the road and find different measures of happiness, if you will, than the acquisition of property or gadgets or things in general, we will not be able to sustain this planet with the 7 billion people that since last year we have. Right? We all know that in the last 150 years or so, the population of the world, which has been static at about 2 billion, little under 2 billion forever, as far as we know, has now moved to 7 billion, just in 2 or 3 generations. And they all are aspiring to a level of extractive consumption, if you will, using the resources of that planet. And at the current patterns, if the entire world were to have our levels of resources, we would need about 7 planets. Scientists argue, is it 6, 7, or 8? But the message is clear. It's more than one. It's far more than one. And that we have to change. And it's so, while we are still working in the margins at all the things that we're talking about, over time, the root cause is that the most important things in life are not things. That's why it's such good advice.
Truly words to live by. I'd like to thank my guest, COO of Greenpeace International, Willem van Rijn, for a truly enlightening look at Greenpeace and how they're working to improve the future of our planet. You can hear this and all my conversations on the Ann Spath Productions Facebook page or on YouTube, keyword search In the Studio with Ann Marie Spatharakis. We encourage you to like and, of course, share them with others. Due to time constraints, you can hear more of my conversation with Mr. van Rijn on our Facebook page, as well as to watch a short video. When we sat down recently, we watched this video from the Greenpeace website together, outlining some of their major accomplishments in 2011. And as we watched, I was able to record Mr. van Rijn as he narrated the photos. It is truly, truly lovely. For more information or to learn how you can help procure a better future for our planet, you can find them online at greenpeace.org. As always, a big thank you to Chris DiPaolo and Steve Conti and everyone at WBLQ, especially our wonderful board operator, Lauren Klankhoff. I'm Ann Marie Spatharakis. Thank you for joining us today in the studio.